Imagine, Lucas always had a special connection with his parents' house. It was a place full of good memories, laughter in the garden, the smell of cake in the oven, and quiet nights, where the only sound was that of the trees swaying in the wind. But recently something had changed. It was as if the environment itself was trying to communicate with him in a way he didn't want to understand. It all started subtly. One afternoon, Lucas was in his room, playing with his cell phone, when he heard a strange sound coming from the attic. It was a clicking sound, as if something had moved up there. He ignored it, thinking it could just be the wind or the old structure of the house adapting. But that crack was repeated several times in the following weeks, always in the same place and always at night. One night, Lucas was about to fall asleep when he heard footsteps. They weren't his father's heavy footsteps or his mother's light ones. These footsteps were different, as if someone or something was trying to go unnoticed. The sound traveled down the hallway and stopped right outside Lucas's bedroom door. He held his breath, waiting to hear the sound of someone opening the door, but nothing happened. After a few minutes that felt like hours, he finally relaxed, convinced that he had imagined it all. Only it wasn't just his imagination. The next day, when he went down to breakfast, Lucas noticed that his car keys, which he always left on the dresser next to the door, were on the kitchen table. He asked his mother if she had moved them, but she just shook her head, confused. "No, son, I didn't even touch the keys. You must have put them there and didn't remember." But Lucas knew that wasn't the case. He always left his keys in the same place, like a habit. He began to feel restless, as if the house was trying to play tricks on him. Days went by and the strange things became more frequent. Objects were moving, doors that had been closed suddenly appeared ajar, and Lucas began to feel a presence, as if he was being watched the whole time. He tried to ignore it, but a constant feeling of unease crept over him. Lucas's father was a practical and skeptical man, someone who always had a logical explanation for everything. So when he mentioned seeing something strange, Lucas knew something was very wrong. It was during the night. Lucas's father was in the office, finishing up some work, when he saw something out of the corner of his eye. He looked down the hallway and saw a figure standing near the stairs. It was tall, thin, and shrouded in shadows, almost indistinct, but definitely there. The figure didn't move, it just stood still, as if it was watching. "I thought it was your mother," he told Lucas the next day, but when I went to look, there was no one there. The house was empty. The father's face was pale, his eyes wide as if he was still trying to understand what he had seen. "I've never been one to believe in these things, but it was strange, Lucas. Very strange." From that point on, Lucas began to realize that he wasn't the only one who felt like the house was different. His mother also began to comment on strange noises, and even the family dog, Rex, avoided certain parts of the house. He kept growling toward the second-floor hallway, the hairs on his neck standing up, and try as they might, Rex wouldn't go beyond that imaginary line he'd drawn himself. One night, when everyone was already in bed, Lucas woke up to a sound that chilled his blood. It was a whisper, low and unintelligible, coming from somewhere in the room. He lay still, eyes wide in the darkness, trying to identify where it was coming from. The whispers intensified, seeming to come from everywhere at once, until they suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more oppressive, heavy as a stone on Lucas's chest. He felt something moving in the room, but he didn't have the courage to look. The next morning he decided he needed to know what was going on. He spoke to his parents and together they decided to investigate the attic where the noises were coming from. Armed with flashlights and a determination that barely hid their fear, they climbed the stairs that led to the oldest and dustiest place in the house.
I hope you liked the story, because the second story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories.
Have you ever had that weird feeling, like when you walk into a place and everything seems normal, but there's something that just doesn't fit? A chill running down your spine, like someone or something is watching you, even if you don't see anyone? It's just too weird, right? Now, imagine living in a place like that, where that feeling doesn't go away. Ever. That's exactly what happened to Maddie and his family. They had just moved into a new house. The first time they saw the place, it seemed perfect. It was an old house with a huge yard full of space for Maddie to play, and his parents were excited about the move. The house was big, 2 stories, and every corner seemed to have hidden stories. But as soon as they started to settle in, things started to get weird. The first thing Maddie noticed were some marks on the walls. It wasn't anything obvious, like a pencil line or dirt. They were outlines of bodies, and the weirdest thing was that they seemed to be those of children. Maddie thought it was all in his head, but he still couldn't stop staring at those marks, as if they moved when he wasn't looking. His parents said they were just old stains, that the house was old, but every time Maddie walked down that hallway he felt like something was wrong. And that's when the nightmares started. The first few nights, Maddie started dreaming about children running down the hallway. In the dream he saw the same marks on the walls, but the children were there, trapped in those stains. They called for help, but Maddie didn't understand what they were saying. He would wake up in a cold sweat, with his heart racing and feeling like something was out of place. The nightmares became more and more frequent. And it wasn't just him. His parents also started having strange dreams. His father dreamed of dark shadows, which seemed to walk around the house at night, while his mother heard voices calling her name from a locked room at the end of the hallway. One time, Maddie woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that there was someone in his room. He looked around but saw nothing. Still, the air felt heavy, like he was being watched. That's when he heard a faint whisper coming from the dark corner of the room. "Maddie, come play with us." He jumped out of bed and ran to his parents' room, who said it was just a dream. But Maddie knew it wasn't. The sound, the cold he felt, it was real. As the days went by, things only got worse. Objects started moving on their own. A chair in the living room, which was always in front of the TV, was found one day in front of the window, as if someone was sitting there, looking out at the garden. Lights flickered for no reason, doors closed by themselves in the middle of the night. And the marks on the walls seemed to spread, becoming clearer, more disturbing. It seemed as if the children's silhouettes were multiplying, filling the hallway with a heavy energy that was hard to ignore. The climax was one night when Maddie woke up and saw a figure standing in the middle of his room. It was a boy, but he wasn't like the children he knew. His eyes were empty, dull, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. She didn't say anything, she just stood there, staring at him. And then, in an icy whisper, the figure murmured, "You'll be staying here with us, too." Desperate, Maddie screamed and his parents ran into the room, but as always, the figure had disappeared. They tried to calm him down, telling him it was just another nightmare, but deep down Maddie knew it wasn't. The house was alive and she wanted them to stay there forever. After that night, the family decided it was time to leave. They packed everything up as quickly as possible and moved to a faraway place. But Maddie never forgot that house, the marks on the walls, the whispers in the night. To this day he wonders what really happened there. Were those children trapped in that house? And the scariest thing, would he have been imprisoned too if he had stayed longer? No one knows. But one thing is certain, that house was not just a place to live. It was a place that wanted more, much more than just residents. And now, every time Maddie passes by an old house, he can't help but look at the walls, looking for those marks. Because somehow he knows those silhouettes are still there, waiting for someone new to play with.
I hope you liked the story, because the third story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. I hope you liked the story.
Just imagine, Max was always the kind of person who didn't believe in anything other than what he could see and touch. Ghosts? To him, this was something out of a movie. Misconceptions? They only existed in stories his friends told to scare them. He always laughed, amused at how people could be so superstitious. But after his father died, things started to change. It wasn't a sudden change, the kind that makes you jump in fright. It was more subtle, almost imperceptible. Max started having nightmares, but they weren't normal dreams. They were the kind that make you wake up in the middle of the night, your heart racing and your body bathed in cold sweat. He didn't remember the details, but the feeling of terror persisted for hours. I woke up in the dark, the room was silent, but with that feeling that I wasn't alone. Eventually, the nightmares just stopped. Out of nowhere, like a switch had been turned off. At first, Max felt relieved. I can finally sleep in peace, he thought. But as the days went by, he started to feel strange. Something inside him said this wasn't right. How could nightmares, which had lasted for months, suddenly disappear, just like that, for no reason? Max continued with his normal life, trying to ignore that uncomfortable feeling. But you know when you feel like something is watching you? That feeling of someone watching your back, even when you're home alone? Well, that's exactly what started to happen. He could be sitting on the couch, watching TV or doing the dishes, and suddenly he'd feel a chill run down his spine. He turned quickly, expecting to see something, but there was never anything there. Nothing but the darkness of the hallway or the emptiness of the room. Things got even stranger when he started hearing whispers. At first he thought it was all in his head. I was tired, stressed, so I didn't pay much attention. But the whispers started to get clearer, closer. They seemed to come from every corner of the house. They were words he couldn't understand, but they were there, always close, as if someone was trying to tell him something. One night, Max was lying in bed, almost falling asleep, when he heard footsteps. They weren't the steps of someone light and agile, but heavy, dragging, as if the person was carrying an enormous weight. He opened his eyes suddenly and his heart raced. The room was dark and he tried to convince himself that it was just the house creaking. But the footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. Max lay still, trying to hear better, and then the footsteps stopped right next to the bed. He held his breath, waiting for what would come next. For a few seconds everything was silent, but then he felt the mattress sink, as if someone had sat on the edge of the bed. Max felt terror grip every fiber of his body, but he couldn't move. It was as if an invisible force was holding him there, forcing him to face the terror that was coming. Eyes wide, he looked to the side and saw a shadow. At first it was just a dark speck in the air, but slowly it took shape. It wasn't clear, like that of an ordinary person, but more like a hazy presence, floating above the mattress. Max couldn't see a face, but he knew it was watching him. Suddenly, the shadow began to speak. Not in normal words, but in that same whisper he'd been hearing. And for the first time, he understood it. You aren't alone. The voice was faint, as if it came from far away, but it was filled with a deep, almost suffocating sadness. Max closed his eyes, wishing it would go away, that it would be just another nightmare. But when he opened them again, the shadow was still there, floating above him. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, as if something was draining all the life from the room. Not knowing what to do, Max began mumbling to himself, trying to calm his nerves. This isn't real. This isn't real, but deep down, he knew he was wrong. This was very real. The next morning, Max woke up exhausted, as if he hadn't slept at all. He dragged himself out of bed, his body heavy and his mind foggy. The events of the previous night were fresh in his memory, but he couldn't convince himself that they had only been dreams. As the days went by, the apparitions became more frequent. The shadow wouldn't leave him alone. It appeared at the most unexpected moments, next to the mirror when he was brushing his teeth, in the corner of the living room when he was watching television, or in the kitchen while he was preparing dinner. Always watching, always observing. Max began to lose control. He could no longer concentrate on work or hold a normal conversation with friends. He was always looking over his shoulder, hoping to see that dark figure. The nights became torturous. He avoided sleeping for fear of what might happen if he closed his eyes for too long. Desperate, Max began researching ghosts and spirits. He, who had never believed in any of this, now found himself reading about purification rituals, protective amulets, and how to get rid of a ghost. Nothing seemed to work. The shadow continued to haunt him relentlessly. Only when he decided to revisit his father's house, which was in a small, faraway town, did things start to make sense. The house was just as he remembered it, old, dusty, and full of memories. But there was something different. A sense that time had stopped in that place, as if something was waiting for him. Exploring the rooms, Max found his father's old room. The walls were filled with old family photographs, but one of them caught his eye. It was a photo of his father, taken when he was still young, but there was something strange about the image. Beside it, almost imperceptible, was the same shadow that had been tormenting Max. It had been there for years, hiding in the darkness. It was then that Max realized the truth. The shadow was not just any spirit. It was his father, or what was left of him. Something had trapped him in this world, a sadness, a guilt that he had never shared in life. And now he was trying to communicate with Max, trying to say something he never had the courage to say in life. Max, shocked by the discovery, made one last effort to free himself from the shadow. He brought a priest to the old house, and together they performed a farewell ritual. Max spoke to the shadow, to his father, for the first time in years. He asked him to find peace, to leave the past behind. And then, suddenly, the shadow disappeared. The air became lighter, and for the first time in months, Max felt alone, but this time, in a good way. The chase was finally over. But Max was never the same again. He was still skeptical, but now he knew that there were things in the world that could not be explained so easily. And every time a shadow moved in the corner of his eye, he wondered, was he really alone? And so, Max went on with his life, certain that not everything that seems unreal is fake. Some shadows don't disappear completely. They just drift away, waiting for the right moment to appear again.
Tell me which story made your hair stand on end? Tell me which one you liked the most? Because in the next video, the story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories.